And I am so pleased to be sharing this podium with her today and would ask her to join us and make a comment.
Thank you so much.
We're Kane sisters.
Beautiful, Gwen. First, I want to say that it's a lot different here this morning than it was in 1994. First, we have the Madam Leader, which we're extremely proud, and a lot more good women here, as well as the men who stood with us all the way through. In 1994, I'd been here just a little while, but I had a pretty good grounding in criminal justice in both the New York State Legislature and Monroe County Legislature in Rochester, New York. And domestic violence had been an issue that I knew very little about, but was extremely troubled by. And the great former Congresswoman, Pat Schroeder, and I worked about a year and a half to get it done. We knew some things that research in those days told us, that in most cases they had found that abusers were persons who had been abused in their life or had grown up in a house where abuse was common. We didn't quite recognize that connection there, and I had a young woman when I was working on the bill here in Congress whose father had died when she was young, and she was married. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And her husband abused her, and she didn't know that that was not normal. I know that won't sound right to you today with what we all know today and everything we are schooled in, but that was not that uncommon. But we knew we had to break that cycle of violence or we'd never be able to deal with this problem. So that was a large part of what we wanted to do with the bill. In addition, we spent a lot of time and a lot of years have gone by training law enforcement, from the police on the street to the district attorneys to the judges, everybody involved, to know how serious this was. And we made it absolutely, the first time we could absolutely talk about it was that what the police had to do was separate both the abuser and the abused, that this was not a matter of going in and trying to break up a fight, going away, and leaving it to go on behind closed doors. This was one of the greatest steps, I think, that we have taken in criminal justice and to protect the people who were weak and vulnerable in the household. So we have reduced the numbers now, as you know, 61%. All of this has worked together to do this. And I'll tell you, though, this past election, I met 3 young women in my district that I'd never talked to about this before. And it's one thing when we all talk about the work we put into it, the research we put into it, 50% of this in Section A4 and all the rest of it. But when you talk to a young woman who says that when I was 17, I left home with a soldier who took me to Colorado and beat me to a pulp, and the Army would not help me, and your office brought me back and had my face put back together. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why we're here. That is what happens with the legislation that we pass. That may be what will happen if we don't get this legislation renewed. We must not wait. It should never have come to this point, ever. If we have to put it on suspension, whatever we have to do, people are waiting out there for us to continue what we have done since 1994 until we don't see this anymore. So I'm delighted with action here this morning, and I know that we're going to get it done when Gwen gets things done. So we'll get it done, but thank you all very much for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership, Congresswoman Slaughter. Yeah, Gwen Moore, she doesn't take no for an answer, as we know. What I want, listening to Louise reminds me of what was happening in the 90s when we passed this bill. Marcy Kaptur, Rosa DeLauro, Nita Lowe, we all had to work on the funding on the Appropriations Committee for that was the next step, and that again had its challenges, but we ended up having some bipartisan support for that, and that was good. And then there were other issues that related to testing the income of the abuser for women who needed legal assistance, and when they'd go for legal assistance, they'd say, well, you don't qualify because your household income is including the income of the abuser. I mean, so there were many hurdles. And the example of when Louise talks about individuals and you talk about individuals, we learn so much from those. And frankly, for some of us, it was an education that was required because none of us had that experience in our own families, neighborhoods, churches, and the rest. Maybe it was there, probably it was, and we just didn't know it. But it was like, who would do that? Who would hit somebody? But they did. And this bill has to pass. So thank you all very much for being.
Can I say one more thing? Because I want to thank you for this. Because
say it in the microphone.
As far as I'm concerned, we have the health care bill because of Leader Pelosi. And up until the time that bill was passed, 8 states and the District of Columbia considered domestic violence to be a pre-existing condition.
Oh, yeah.
Did you know that? And if you had been beaten up before, you could not get insurance because you would get beaten up again. Wow. So, you know, we can talk about decades ago, but this was last couple years. So thank you again for that. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions that members this started later than we had anticipated because of the floor.